Hey guys, this is miicrow. I wanted to make a video about attribute points because of a video I put out recently, and then Duke Sloth also made a video about this recently. I think the general sentiment of these videos is correct that 725 isn't necessarily BIS for a lot of classes, and or it's not worth prioritizing for 90 to 95% of players. It's more of like an elitist end game thing that you can hit that I don't think you need to hit to be successful in terms of like New World. But I did want to talk about attribute points because 725 does give you 50 attribute points, which does let you hit thresholds that make certain builds better. So in terms of like an example of a build where hitting 725 doesn't necessarily matter, looking at life staff, for example, life staffs usually try to get 250 con, put the rest into focus. You're already healing so much with 350 focus that you don't really get a benefit from going beyond this. There's no attribute bonus that's additional that you're going to hit. So at that point, it's like, it doesn't really matter how beyond this you go. So some people, for a class like Life Staff, might prioritize not hitting 250 con, or they might prioritize going for like a low gear score offhand, which would reduce their gear score and make them tankier in terms of PvP. And you could also pick up like an illegal perk with some weapons, like refreshing, for example. Some people do a low gear score refreshing rapier. So there's other things to consider rather than just is 700 just being strictly better than 725. And I feel like that wasn't really made clear in terms of there's a bit of a gray area there because it depends on the class. Like if I were to go through gear sets of builds I've already made, like Fire Staff Abyss. Like this is a class that you really want to have a good amount of con, you really want to have a good amount of int. So it is nice to be able to hit like maybe 400. Like you could hit pretty standard build with this would be 200 con, 400 int. You could hit that with 700, but if you have 725, you get 450 int. In that kind of circumstance, it doesn't make a huge difference if you have the extra int or not. Builds where it does make a really big difference. For example, if you look at do I have Hatchet SNS on here still? Yeah, I've Hatchet SNS. So Hatchet SNS hit 350 strength, which is a big damage breakpoint for that class, and 200 dex with 250, or with 725. So for this class, it's like very, very high value to go to that. And if you go 700, if you wanted to hit those, you'd have to run 50 con, which is a lot harder, or you'd have to run Attune Leather Pants. Attune Leather Pants is still something that's used for extra stats in terms of PvE very commonly, because the 25 thresholds, 25 attribute thresholds, are still pretty good in this game. So for example, for Evade Rapier, actually I think Sherlock might have a build with this. So let me go to New World builds, shout to Sherlock. If I go to DPS, I go to Evade Rapier. I think in this one he shows it with Attune Leather Pants. Yeah, so like with Attune Leather Pants, you can hit 355 and 300 dex, which is a really nice bonus to hit. Everyone knows that 300 dex is an amazing attribute bonus, but I wanted to go over those a little bit more specifically too. You could hit 25 strength, which will boost your light attacks, 25 focus, which will give you CDR, and that's just like an abomination of stat points that you can't necessarily hit if you're 700 gear score, but if you're 725, you can hit that. So there's like a lot of little things like this where it's like, make sure you look at your attribute points before deciding what's BIS and what's not. Again, the summary of the 700 versus 725 is if you're 700, you're going to be dealing about, I'd say 3% minimum DPS less than a 725 character. And then in terms of your armor wise, you're going to be taking about 1.1% more damage at a minimum. But if you can contribute, or if you can also look at attribute points, like if you up your con, if you're able to up your con, that's like basically having passive health perks in your gear, right? So that could be kind of beneficial. Sometimes the perks on your armor will actually get more beneficial the higher gear score you get. New Worlds kind of seems to soft cap a lot of them at the 700 gear score threshold, so that's a little bit less important. But basically, there's other factors to consider here. I'd say, again, summary, 95% of players, don't worry about this. 5% who want the ultra abyss, ultra optimize, perfect gear setup, which I know I make a lot of videos on. But I don't run like ultra optimized gear setups either. Like I run budget gear setups like pretty consistently. Like my raid gear right now has featherweight on there, and I'm still trying to get Attune Leather Pants. But like I've got, because I have featherweight on here, I was able to pick up pants on a fresh start with omnidirectional evade and enchanted ward, which is like really, really nice. So there's like weird stuff like that to consider too. I'd say a lot of builds have like great areas, and people are very like absolutist with this. It's like, oh, you have to run this, oh, you have to run this. It's like a little bit more situational depending on like what gear you actually have acquired at the moment. like this is a really good heavy piece that I've required, but it's lower gear score, right? Like I'm not running a 725 piece because I have elemental version, health, and strike conditioning, which is like basically BIS for PvE endgame or PvP endgame. Or like I'm running in my tank build, I'm running a dexterity based thing that has despised on there because it has despised on there, but I don't actually really want dex for this build. Like this is like more of a strength oriented tank build. So there's a lot more gray areas like that. In terms of talking about attribute points itself, the main thing to consider here is there are weapons that scale primarily with an attribute point, and you can see these by hovering over the thing. So like sword and shield is primarily strength, secondary is dexterity. There's a YouTube video I did recently where I optimized a DPS setup for Void Blade. If you haven't seen that, I'd recommend looking at it, because I realized at a certain point that it was actually not worth it to continue putting points into int, and it was more beneficial to put your stats into focus, right? Because Void Gauntlet has 65% scaling with focus and 90% scaling with int, and the more and more points you put into one attribute, the more diminishing returns you have, which is why for a lot of like high-level BIS glass cannon builds, people try to do dual stat builds, not single stat builds, but certain weapons can't take advantage of these, and you have to take advantage of other mechanics to boost their damage up significantly. Like Fire Staff only scales with intelligence, but because it's doing elemental damage, you could use the elemental band or Azoth conductors to kind of boost your damage overall and kind of compensate for the lack of damage that you get from stat thresholds. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on there. But let's kind of look through these side by side. So high level, you have a 25 bonus threshold. These are all really, really powerful and something that you should consider hitting. And then no matter what build you're running, so like if you can get 25 focus, like you get 5% CDR, like that's a passive refreshing. Usually if you want to hit these thresholds, you need Attuned Leather Pants. If people don't know what Attuned Leather Pants is, it's the artifact that you get from finishing the Elysian Wild main story quest. So if you can fully complete the main story quest, you'll get this artifact, and it basically gives you like 10 extra attribute points to all around. I could pull it up here too, just to show it. So it gives you, well, basically more flexible gear options. So this is it at 700. If I go up to 725, like it's an extra 11. So it's like you would hit those 25 bonuses relatively easily because you're already like halfway there. And then you also have extra stats from the Magnify as well. So that's a really common artifact that you see in PvE. It's a very good beginner artifact for PvP as well, until you can hit all the stat thresholds that you want. And you just get that from just going through the main story. So it's like relatively easy to get. Just takes a little bit of time. And that kind of helps with that aspect a lot, where you can hit these 25 thresholds. Now, the 50 thresholds, in terms of looking at these, for strength, this is going for heavy attack damage. You're not typically going to be doing heavy attacks with strength. They've been pushing more and more to do heavy attacks. The build that does take advantage of this the most is Greatsword. There was an argument at one point to try to get this for bow as well. It turned out it was a DPS loss compared to putting the extra points into dexterity, because in theory, most bow players just spam heavy attacks, so it's a 10% bonus for sacrificing 50 stats, but those 50 stats tended to be more beneficial in dexterity, but it's something that's like usually worth testing. If you don't want to test it as well, you can go to New World Database, for example, and then you can see, like, if I wanted to look at my light attacks with my I think this is with the hatchet out, is like what that one is. If I want to look at light attacks and say I wanted to maybe do a little bit less strength, like take these 9 points out of strength and put them into dexterity, just to see an example, you can see like how the damage output changes here, and then use that to help make decisions. So that's a really, really helpful tool as well. Going on to dexterity here, 5% base damage while at full health. This is just fantastic overall. Any build that is like more glass cannon oriented tends to run this. If you're a brawler kind of build, it's a lot less beneficial. A 50 int is 5% base damage increase to targets inflicted with a damage over time effect. Damage over time effects are very consistent, so this is pretty consistently just a 5% base damage increase. Again, very, very useful in PvE. There is one other trick with this too. There is the Wizened hat, I think it's called. Yeah, the Wizard's hat. This has 45 intelligence, and because all your attributes start at 5, you can just, with running that, you could hit this threshold really easily, and this is a really nice threshold to hit for PvE. So for certain builds that aren't super int-based, some people consider running this Wizard's hat for that, to take advantage of the extra stats. Attuned Leather Pants also does something similar, but usually people use this hat if you're just looking to optimize for just going to that 50 int threshold, but if you're looking for more well-rounded stat builds, then a Toon Leather Pants is better. So it basically depends how many stat categories you go into. For Toon Leather Pants, I think it tends to be better if you go into like 3 to 4 main stat categories. But Wizard's Hat, like if you're only going into 1 or 2 and you want to hit that 50 int, like it's a really good option for that as well. 50 focus is something that you look at for tanks pretty commonly. This is a 10% incoming healing increase, so this is like basically a passive divine, which a lot of people run on their amulet anyways. Like on my main amulet, I run divine on all the time. It's super, super helpful. So there's a nice bonus there. 50 cons, 5% physical armor. This is really important for a lot of PvE stuff, so you don't just get one tapped. Like for the raid, a lot of people try to hit 50 cons so that they can live the more early stages, but that they mess up the sandworm mechanics. If you're going for the Elysian Wilds raid, it's also like pretty common to try to hit that because a lot of the bosses deal physical damage. It's like more burst oriented, so it can help you a bit there. The 100 thresholds, we got 100, we got 10% physical damage. Obviously very good if you have any physical damage build. It's really hard to get to 100 if you're not going to have stat scaling in your weapon for that, so it's like something I wouldn't try to force. For dexterity, we got the 5% base damage increase while your stamina is not full. I feel like this one's a little bit harder to take advantage of than people give it credit for, but it is like useful to some extent. For intelligence, we got 10% base damage to light and heavy elemental attacks. This is not like it used to be 15%. This is like one of the best thresholds I'd say in the game if you are primarily, like if you're going towards intelligence and you're trying to do damage with your primary. So like the one that like kind of screams out with this being so good is like usually a blunderbuss if you're going for like an elemental based blunderbuss setup, which some people go, right? Because then you can go away from the thrust damage, go to more elemental, take advantage of the elemental band, which is a fantastic artifact, one of the best rings in the game, or actually it probably is the best ring in the game. I think it's like a top 5 artifact in the game at this point with how it's behaving. And you can just get the extra, trade the extra empower and get the base damage increase. So there's like some weapons that this is like super, super helpful for. Wouldn't say it works super well for everything, but it's very nice. Focus is 20% mana, regenerate, increase max mana by 20% of base value. Basically only useful if you have Void Gauntlet or if you're a healer, because nothing else uses mana that often. 100 con is 10% of your base health. Base health in this game is like, I think it's 8,024 exactly, so this is like 800 bonus health. Can be helpful for a lot of squishy builds. So a lot of PvE builds, they'll either choose to go 0 con, like 50 con, or 100 con. There's not usually an in-between, and it just depends like how much you want to live. Generally for PvE, for beginning players, I'd recommend getting to 100 con, and that makes stuff a lot easier. 150 con is really good for PvP. This is the only non-bugged way to reduce critical damage taken that's incoming right now. The other way, as we've talked about a lot, is you have to take off your gear and put it back on to take advantage of this PvP crit damage taken bonus every single time that you die or teleport to a new instance. That bug still has not been fixed by AGS and is super annoying to work around, but that's kind of where we're at. You could either switch to a gear set that has completely different pieces or switch to an empty one, and both of those will solve that problem. So going back to here, we have 150 int. Or wait, we're at 150. Yeah, we have 150 int, so 10% increased elemental damage. This used to be 15%, still very, very good. A little bit less OP than it once was. Some people that are returning to the game do remember like using T2 gems to take advantage of this and doing absurd amounts of damage, because T2 gems used to scale at 200% of the damage value that it should have had for only 20% of the damage. It basically just ended up being more valuable to use a cheap gem than a more expensive gem. Nowadays, it's still it's more valuable to use the expensive gem over the cheap gem. So it can be used, but it's like something that I don't think people really try to force 150 int as much as they used to, if that makes sense. Still really good for BB though. Focus was 20% outgoing healing effectiveness, obviously very helpful for healers, not really helpful for anyone else. Dexterity, we got 50% duration to dot effects. So the main thing here is this is extending the base damage or base duration, and you can't be reduced by things like vigor. Vigor works off of base, so it won't affect this at all. There is a new perk called Hasted Vigor, and that will reduce the damage from dot effects for this perk, which is a reason why a lot of people like Hasted Vigor, but it's not the main reason why people like Hasted Vigor. If you're a dot-based build, this is a really good thing to hit, though. You got 15 or 150 strength, 15% stamina regen while exhausted. Not super useful. Some tank players try to force getting this and then put a lot of stats into con and a good amount into focus. I don't think it's as important as people make it out to be, though. There's 200 strength, one of the best attribute points in the game. 10% damage on stunned, slowed, or rooted enemies. Who is mining in the background? Okay, jump is just... He does this all day, every day, and I don't know why. He just throws hatchets at walls. Like he's done this for like 3 weeks, and I don't know what's going on. But we like Eden Grove, so we out here. So anyways, 200 strength is fantastic for just increasing your damage overall. It's basically if someone's CC'd at all, which is very, very common in any sort of PvP instance, it's very good. A PvE, I think it's a little bit less common, but still is very nice to have just a flat 10% increase. So it's like, this is where it comes back to the attributes, right? Like if I could hit 200 strength, and I couldn't hit 200 strength without going to 725 Gearscore gear, it would be worth hitting this 200 strength attribute threshold, and that 725 would be this, if that makes sense. So it's like some of these ones that are, you know, if you hit me, I'll increase your damage by 10%. It's like, okay, then it's worth having the extra attribute points. But if you're not able to take advantage of that, then it's not usually worth going for that 725. We have 200 dex, 10% bonus backstab and headshot damage. Very good for PvE. A little bit less useful for PvP because it's hard to consistently be behind people. But still something some builds take advantage of and completely destroy people with. 200 int is mana generation on crit. This used to be mana on dodge. Still is very practical, very effective. Focus is 20% buff duration. Mostly useful for healers and flail. There is a soft tank tech where you can use this to increase the duration of buffs, and then that makes you effectively tankier because then you have higher buff duration on things like Fortify. A little bit niche, but kind of an underrated threshold in my opinion. Especially with the new... with SNS now, because of one with the shield with a tower shield bonus. So then you could basically, with these two bonuses combined, you could have almost infinite sustain on things like Defender's Resolve if someone doesn't have a buff strip, which is completely stupid strong in PvP. And in PvE as well, but it's not something people usually take advantage of in PvE as much, because they're looking to try to force damage, and focus is not how you scale damage effectively. 200 cons, 10% increase to physical and elemental armor. This is the most important con threshold to hit. If you could hit it, works very, very well in PvE and PvP. Would highly recommend. 250 con is basically burst damage protection. Weirdly helpful for kind of squishier builds or people that like are static in a spot and might get jumped. So like think of healers, for example. Healers sometimes with the nameplate feature right now where you can't necessarily see nameplates super effectively. So it's like I don't see Man with the Axe, like if I look here, pop up like super like all the time. And if he was, say, a 5 con hatchet build, which is weirdly popular nowadays, he could just hit me from behind. I would take a chunk of my health off. If I had 250 con, that first hit wouldn't do that much damage and it would give me some time to react. So that's the main part where it's useful and why a lot of healers try to force getting the 250 con. There's 250 focus. This is basically a passive healing buff, mostly useful in PvE. If you're farming in PvP, it could be useful, but like influence races, it could be useful, but not something that's like commonly loved. 250 int is like similar to 150 dex, where it extends the duration of dots, but this one's by 30%. A must-have attribute thing for any kind of dot-oriented class. The main ones that come to mind are musket, fire, staff. Bow can be nice, but it's like you're not going to get to this on bow. So I'd say mostly musket, fire, staff take advantage of this. Void Gauntlet's also nice too, because all your damage from your rends on your is from a dot effect, so it will extend that as well. We got 250 dex, gain 10% in power for 3 seconds after successfully dodging an attack. Not that useful. To be honest, this is kind of a dead threshold. It's like not really that practical. 250 strength is generating stamina while performing basic melee attacks. I feel like this one's really underrated, especially now that heavy attacks have grit when you get to 300 con. So it's like if you charge an attack, you have grit, and while you have grit, you regen mana. I feel like people could take advantage of this a little bit more, especially with like some tricky stuff right now with Great Axe. So with Great Axe, for example, if you have grit on your heavy attacks, and then you have 12% base damage reduction while grit is active. Also, when you go for a heavy attack. I believe it pulls them towards you. Yeah, heavy attacks of the Great Axe pull foes closer towards you. And if you pull a target, then they're rooted for 0.4 seconds. So there's a little bit of a combo there for like Great Axe, where it's like, say I'm low mana, I don't necessarily want to spam a light attack. I could go for a heavy attack, charge, have grit, charge my stamina, and then I'd be able to go back to like kind of dodge light attack spamming. So kind of underrated tech in my opinion. I think we already covered all of those, so let's go to 300. I want to talk about 300 Con actually first, because this one's really peculiar in a few spots. So this one is grit while charging and performing heavy attacks. Used to be light and heavy attacks. Significantly nerfed. Changes how the entire game feels right now, and a lot of heavy attack builds are becoming more powerful in PvE. And PvP, people are trying to figure out weird ways to get grit, because it's a super powerful status effect that basically prevents you from being able to do normal movement. Like, you can't get staggered. You can still get stunned in it, but you can't get staggered, and that's just like generally helpful for consistently hitting attacks. There is a weird spot where, if I look back to that Great Axe thing, right? This adds grit to heavy attacks. There's a difference between heavy attacks and charging while charging and performing heavy attacks. So basically 300 Con gives you a longer window to get that grit. So like when we did that Bruiser video earlier, I was like, there's no purpose to go up, hit 300 Con anymore. Just drop it as low as you can and put the rest in a damage. There is a circumstance here where if you are using heavy attacks pretty consistently, this will give you a longer grit window, and that might be worth sacrificing some damage for, because it's just a really nice quality of life thing to have. But if you're not doing heavy attacks, then I would say it's a little bit less worth it. 300 Focus is 20% fortify for 10 seconds when healing allies while your mana is at or above 50%. 60-second cooldown per ally, so it's not on you, it's on the allies itself. I think this is like the most underrated attribute point in the game. This is like insanely strong for certain weapons, so a lot of people like don't like to go into focus at all for certain things, but like for flail, for how I build flail, I like to go to 350 focus, and that's a big reason why. Because if I run better together, while near one or more allies, grant passive healing to self and all allies that heals for 16% of weapon base damage every 3 seconds. This is giving all my allies a passive 20% fortify, which is quite nice, and is just like a very nice effect to put on people, especially like an OPR where people have a little bit less passive fortify consistently. So that's kind of an underrated one. We got 300 int, 7% base damage to targets below 50% health. Decent, more of a finisher style thing. So that's why some players play intelligence weapons like Fire Staff as like finisher style abilities. I've seen some techs even too, where this again comes back to macros, which I'm not a big fan of, but if you're a PC player, you can take advantage of. Some people have macroed abilities like Pillar of Fire to trigger target lock and then Pillar of Fire like slightly later, and this causes Pillar of Fire to basically always hit because it's going to be centered on the target, which is ideally where you want to position your Pillar of Fire. And if you hit someone that's below 50%, then you just basically just blow them up with this ability, because they usually have Fire Staff like stacks on them in terms of Smolder, and Pillar of Fire deals 5% more base damage for each stack of Smolder on a target, maximizes at 5%, and it's just like, this is a really good finisher style thing that you can use to take advantage of that perk, but requires usually macros, or you'd have to quickly hit target lock to the correct target and then use your caster Pillar of Fire. So I guess it doesn't require a macro, but macros definitely make it easier. And this is like something you can use to take advantage of that kind of style. And then there's also gems, for example, that do more damage to targets that are below, I think it's like 30% health with an emerald. And that's like another thing that you could use to help like those finisher / fragger style builds. We have dexterity for 300, best attribute point in the entire game. Weapon swapping will cleanse all stun and root crowd control effects with the 30-second cooldown. This is so good. If you could get this threshold at all in PvP, you take it. That's the main reason why Spear is so strong in PvP still, even though the tracking got nerfed, is you can hit 300 dex, and 300 dex is like just a get out of jail free card. So people have Stoneform, which is a get out of jail free card. They have a Cleanse Pot, which is a less good, but still good get out of jail free card. You get 300 dex, which is a get out of jail free card. And then sometimes they have an escape ability on top of that, and you just can't kill people that consistently hit this threshold. It just makes people so much tankier than they typically should be. We got 300 strength, 7% base damage while your health is under 90%. I feel like this could be buffed significantly. Like this could be like 15%, and it would still be like kind of balanced. Not a god-awful threshold, but not something that you're really
looking to force to get to. We got 350 strength, which on the other hand is a very nice threshold, 10% base damage increase to abilities in a final attack and a melee light chain attack. So this is a threshold that all Bruiser players should be trying to hit right now. I think this is more important than 300 con. And it's something that was changed in the past, right? Because you had to hit 300 con. Some people are like, okay, maybe I'll go to 350 con and get base damage reduction while I have grit. But now it's like more of a, Bruisers are more of a DPS style class. They're looking to do giant burst damage, kill 10 people plus at a time, and this just really helps enable that kind of style. There's other classes too that could take advantage of this, but it's more single target oriented and like less AoE oriented. A lot of people aren't going to their final light attack, so I feel like that first part isn't as useful. It's more classes that look to do burst damage from abilities. So like one that would kind of come to mind is like Blunderbuss. If you're putting your plague splitting grenades on the ground, this can be very helpful for that as well. We have 350 dex, which is 15% crit chance while empowered. There's some underrated tech with this for certain builds. So like Rapier, for example, if you crit, you gain 5% CDR, right? So there's like a Rapier tank-based build where you go for Flurry, which has a bunch of attacks. If you run 350 dex, you crit more, and whenever you crit, you reduce the cooldowns. And basically, if you run this with this 350 dex, run Magnetic Gauntlets, you can literally just go infinite, and you could just go Flurry, evade, Flurry, evade, Flurry, evade, and you could just live forever. So there's some really underrated tech with that, but I don't think it's something that people necessarily force themselves to get, but it's very nice if you have it. Next up, we have Intelligence, 10% ability damage. Must have for anything that can scale with intelligence. Blunderbuss is like, I think, the kind of the most interesting one with this, because you could go strength or int base with Blunderbuss depending on like what your offhand is. And then 350 strength is really nice to hit. 350 intelligence is also really nice to hit, so it's like nice to hit one of those. We have 350 focus. Reduce the ability cooldowns by 20% their max duration upon activating a heart rune ability. The trick here is its max duration. So say you have 4 refreshing and 50 focus. Now, instead of this being 20% value, it's like effectively like 25 to 30% value. Like it scales very, very quickly. A lot of healers will actually just use their stone forms in spots, like if they're not super pressured, and which depends on the meta, they'll use their stone form as a way to get CDR so that they can cast another ability to heal people more. So it's like, it's this weird trade-off with this perk, where sometimes it's better to give up your self-survivability to enable others, and it's a must-have perk for healers to acquire. So like healers in general need to hit 250 con, need to hit 350 focus, but those 50 other attributes that you can get from going 725 don't really matter. So that's like one of those classes where Frigid Dawn might be a little bit better for than, say, trying to get full 725 or something like that. There's another weird aspect with healer builds too, though, where if you heal for more than an ally, you will override their healing effect, and this is bad in several circumstances. So for if I go to Life Staff, for example, and I were to cast Beacon, if my Beacon heals more than another ally's, but their beacon has a longer duration, the higher heal beacon will override the one that has the longer duration. So sometimes you end up in a spot where someone's healed for less overall because your beacon expires first. So what people try to do in terms of PvP healers is they try to coordinate the amount of focus that they have for the entire army. So it's like, okay, could everyone hit 350 focus? Yes. Okay, we'll try to run 350 focus this war. Next war, can everyone hit 370 focus? Yes. Okay, we'll run 370 focus. And if you can't get to an even value, just put the rest in the Constitution, if that makes sense. So it's something that is worth noting and something that kind of gets manipulated a lot. 350 con got a really big nerf because of the 300 con passive grit change. Not as valuable anymore, but if you do have a way to get passive grit, common uses are like stone form, certain abilities give you grit, heavy attacks for certain weapons can give you grit, obviously because of 300, but in those circumstances you can kind of live a little bit better. I don't find this to be super useful from a PvP side, but now from a PvE side, if you're going like a high con tank build, which is like what I would recommend for the Gorgon raid in general for like newer players, then you can go for basically heavy attacks, either full or half heavies. The difference being, I don't think I've explained this before. Let me put on a sword real quick and show what a full heavy is. So this is a full heavy. This is a light attack. This is a half heavy. Half heavies apply the status effects from the full heavy, but they take less time to charge. So certain spots are actually more useful. When you're doing DPS to a boss, for example, if you're trying to break stamina, you want a full heavy. If you want grit, you want a half heavy. If you're in PvP and you want to apply a status effect like Trenchant Rend or Plague Strikes, which is a bonus that you can get to swords, and other artifacts too. Like that's a good spot for half heavies. This is particularly useful for sword because sword and shield has the fastest half heavy and full heavy attack in the game. It's even better than greatsword, I believe, which is a little bit weird. So it's like a really good weapon to take advantage of that. Underrated thing, I think, now, but used to be heavily overrated to hit 350 con. So that's kind of it when it comes to the constitution, like all those attribute points. Hope this made 200 versus 250 a little bit more clear as well in terms of what's bis. Again, general sentiment, you don't need to hit it. Like I'm running 394 gear score when I'm going into raids. The main thing that's noteworthy is your armor gear score. Or your armor gear score doesn't actually affect the damage that you take. It's the armor itself, which scales with gear score, but it doesn't scale super fast, right? Because we're talking about 700 versus 725, and we're saying 725 is like 1.1% more tanky. So it's like, that's not super worth being stressed about in terms of having high armor in terms of raids. Your jewelry literally does not affect anything. It's just the attribute points there, and the perks itself scale sometimes with gear score. So like, I'm running a 663 amulet. That doesn't bring my gear score down too much. If I were to put in this other one, it's a lot higher. It brings it up by only 4. So it's like, it doesn't really matter which amulet you run. Same with all the other forms of jewelry. But the actual bonuses under here, like health, I think can scale up to like 7.7% versus this is 6%. So that might be worth considering. For weapons, I'd say these are basically always worth getting to 725 because it will give you significant DPS increases in terms of like a free 3.3%. Which is basically like running another perk, right? Because Enchanted is like a 4 to 5% perk, and 3.3% would apply to your armor, apply to your weapons. All those other bonuses be multiplied by it, so it actually might be a little bit more valuable than that. So, something worth considering. And I hope this was helpful for you guys. If you have any questions about this, kind of let me know, but it's a little bit of a gray area in terms of like what gear score you really need. I'd say for the majority of builds, 725 is nice to have, but 700 is definitely all you need. I still think Frigid Dawn is bis for certain builds, but there is also arguments that, hey, maybe you don't take that second illegal perk and you just slap on an extra conditioning or something like that. And conditioning is like a really nice piece to have. So like I could have strike conditioning on here, and that's like basically the equivalent, if not better, than having Enchanted Ward. So something to think about there as well. With that being said, peace.